All right, good morning, good afternoon, Dan. Great to meet a namesake always. Dan Smolen here. You're out of DC, Dan. You've been in the work world, how the world works space for a while, but also, and somewhat more uniquely than you are based in DC, which is continues to be the center of many, many topics that not only do we speak about here in the US, but we speak about around the world. And you've some incoming leadership that has some fascinating ideas for how they want what are we up to? 3 million federal workers, something like that? Maybe a
There
little bit more.
there are 3 million approximately federal workers across all 50 states in the District of Columbia, and then beyond that, the
All
territories.
right. Wow.
Within the DC area, it's a little harder to track. I think it's probably just under 300,000, many of whom are knowledge workers, so
Mm,
they've benefited from getting away from the traditional co-location to working
mm.
in a hybrid fashion, perhaps at home, perhaps in a shared office arrangement.
So I mean, you've been in DC for years. You've got a great perspective of this. Not only do you help companies make their work and how they work, but also you're in DC. I imagine you've got a bunch of friends that are exposed to or are in government. Tell us about it. How's this news of Elon and Vivek's Doge department for government efficiency? How's it being received?
Well, I'll take a step back here. I operate in the future of work a little differently than a lot of people who are coming at it from a work tech standpoint. I spent 20 years in executive recruitment, 13 of which running my own boutique firm. So I look at work from a humanistic standpoint. How does it impact people? And I further this idea of a work fit where work becomes a wonderful part of a day doing other wonderful things, getting us away from the clock, getting us away from this traditionalized notion we've had for 120 years in this country and perhaps in the industrialized world where work is done
Yeah.
in a office building, in a factory. And well, we know that's changing quite a bit. But here in the Washington, D.C. area, our workforce it's not all federal workers, it's not all government workers, but a lot of what happens here happens because of the government. So you have perhaps 300,000 full-time knowledge-based workers around the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. But then you also have a core of people who are feeding the beast. They may be working in trade associations. They may be working in nonprofits. They may be working for public companies that impact the defense infrastructure. So, in regards to the posts that you put out on social media within the last couple of days, this is hitting the area like a juggernaut. Why? Because people that work in the federal government may not be career ambitious the way that other people are. They may not be thinking about that next career move the way somebody in the private sector might think of it.
Hmm.
They may not be looking at their resume or CV regularly to correct or to refine or to make brand embellishments the
Mm,
way that somebody in the private sector may be doing and may be more prone to job change than somebody in the federal government. People got into federal government because it's great work. It pays well. It historically has been shielded from downsizing and layoffs and things like that.
Yeah, as you look at the data, the federal government level of employees looks very consistent. It seems to be the states local that has grown over the last 50 years and grown dramatically.
Right. So why this is a juggernaut is because let's say that even 100,000 or 150,000 of those 300,000 core employees to the government get suddenly cast off, or
Right.
they decide not to go back to the co-location 5 days a week and therefore are let go. So you got a whole slew of people who haven't really been readied for a career transition yet. They haven't thought about it. And typically with a career transition is it takes time. You got to dream about what you want to do next. You got to think about how you can take all the skill, all the subject matter expertise that you've had in government and find a way to apply that to work in another company, perhaps work as an entrepreneur or as a contract employee. That takes time. So there
Mm,
potentially could be a lot of people on the beach, so to speak. And when that happens, they stop spending money. And therein lies the rub. They may not be shopping the way they used to. They may not be buying big ticket items the way they used to, cars and durable appliances for their home, washers and dryers and microwaves and TVs and refrigerators, etc.
mm,
Um, Biggest of all is how their loss of revenue is going to impact service businesses, dry cleaners, or daycare operators, or, oh, I don't know, you name it. There is an ecosystem around the federal government within my metropolitan area, Dan, that depends on this federal workforce. They may not work
yeah.
in it, but those people would normally spend money in a take it for granted sort of way. And
Right.
now there's the risk that all that goes away. So it's not just a surface doge improvement of the efficiency of government by making it smaller and wielding an axe to take hundreds of thousands of people off the payroll. Doing this in an economy like Washington, D.C., will have a deleterious effect on everybody.
Mm,
Everybody.
mm. I mean, as I said at the start, like I'm a big fan of podcasts that don't, everyone doesn't agree with each other. So allow me to be the
Mm,
attack antagonist for a little minute. Does
go
the
for
rest of
it.
the country care? Right. It feels like, and I don't want to make this political, it feels like the country gave the incoming administration a mandate to blow things up. Right. So does the rest of the country care about what it sees as privileged desk workers um, having to find a new role? Does the rest of the country care? And I guess more importantly, why do you think the rest of the country should care beyond just the metro of DC?
Answering the question, does the rest of the country care, is very difficult. I don't spend a lot of time listening to the social media that are political at this point because
Yeah.
it's not helpful. It's not helpful to me. It raises my
No,
blood pressure. But
sure.
but but why should they care? The largest federal component of workforce is in California. It's 8%.
Yep.
It's bigger than where I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is about almost 7%. But
Hmm.
around Northern Virginia, and a lot of people don't go into Washington, D.C., but within Northern Virginia, it's a huge, huge metropolitan area.
Mm,
These, a lot of people here are in the private sector working for, let's say, defense contractors, big
hmm,
companies. They might be in related to healthcare. They might work for Amazon or Amazon Web Services. They might work for Boeing. They may even work for Volkswagen of America, which has their US headquarters here. There are a lot of companies where, even though the people that work there don't work for the federal government, they better care because their career stability may be in question.
mm,
So, to the rest of the country, do you care? I don't know if it's resonating outside the beltway, so to speak, Dan. I really don't know. But any big impact on employment will certainly have an impact on all the other economic levers, inflation,
Mm,
cash flow, uh, supply chain. It would be a big impact on the economy, and how it impacts one doesn't really know.
yeah.
But I think people should care about it. And I'm hearing from people on across the spectrum, some who I know voted for Trump, who were saying, you know what, this is a stupid idea. Because if it's done with a meat axe,
Sure.
sure, it's going to be dramatic, but it's going to be a shockwave, and it's going to have the unintended consequence of hurting other aspects of the economy that right now may not be thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, I got rightly called up on this post about Kool-Aid. Granted, I didn't realize the full extent of the background of that story. I must have grown up in an era where it was just something,
Oh, yeah.
where it was just seen as being on the same page as somebody or on a particular issue. So I got schooled on that quite rightly over the last couple of days here. But, here in Silicon Valley, one of the kind of abiding rules is never bet against Elon. And
Mhm.
you know, one of the things that Elon does is he breaks things down to their absolute core. Just thinking about how he came up with SpaceX. He was trying to get something into space. He found it incredibly expensive, went to Russia to try and figure out how can he pay for a rocket to go up. It was incredibly expensive, inefficient, old technology. And on the plane home, he starts reading the story. So says the story, starts reading about how to do it. And that's the genesis of SpaceX, and that's come with huge advantages for the
Mhm.
taxpayer, right, in terms of the cost per launch and things like that compared to what it would be previously. And heaven forbid we would be reliant upon other nations to send stuff to this international space station right now in today's geopolitics. So I'm pleased he's on our team, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Um, but one of the things that I struggled to get around is the difference between a private citizen or private worker for a private company and a public worker. And where I'm from in the UK, being in public work was never really a well paid job. It was
Mhm.
a job that the privileged could do because they could afford to do it because they had income elsewhere
Yeah.
historically. And so, talk me through like the career part of this because if I worked at Tesla, SpaceX, the Boring Company, Neuralink. You know, Elon has got a number of different levers in which to incentivize me, not only keeping my job, but also doing great work, doing kind of zeitgeist changing work for the planet. But then he's got, which ambitious people like to do, and ambitious people like to work for the very best, or at least as they see it. But then he's got equity and stock options, and he's got pay and bonuses. So talk to
Yeah.
me about how does that work in DC, like that side of the okay, we've got. It's quite inspiring, right? Back in the day, we're going to go to the moon because it's bloody hard to do. Talk me through how you incentivize better employees.
Wow. You teed up a lot here. How to incentivize federal employees. You know, I don't know. I don't know the best way to do that. Federal employees, governmental employees, generally speaking, have, mm, I'm going to get flogged for this, but there's more of a safety net frame where federal work, generally speaking, was remunerative, and it was career safe. Well, not
Right.
flashy, but you know what? There are people in the federal sector, some of whom are our nation's subject matter experts on everything.
Sure.
the federal workplace gave them the opportunity to be truly academic, to be curious about subjects. And, it's not just tech or what everything, it could be about zoology. All of that trickles down to the private sector in some way. But the other side of governmental work, if you will, and the structure of how government operates is that it's usually terribly inefficient in some respects. I'll give you the biggest one. I came out of
Well, I think that's very quick. I think that's the thing that folks like Elon and Vivek, who obviously founded his own business too, really struggle with is like, okay, are you running on OKRs? Are you running on KPIs? How do I know that what I'm putting in is being measured from an outcomes perspective? I think that's one of the big actual pieces. Maybe it's not presenteeism, right? But it's actually the efficiencies of why should they have a safe job when the rest of the country has to hit their stock market performance for the quarter to keep their jobs?
Well, yeah, I mean, I get that, but let me give you an example of something that day to day I'm familiar with, which is both good and bad, and that's the
Yeah,
United States Postal Service.
yeah.
I had this thought in my mind that somehow the post office was somehow written into the U.S. Constitution. I got to check that. I'm not sure, but its importance dates back to this nation's founding. I mean, Ben Franklin was talking about the importance of mail because it
Hmm.
bound the colonies together before they were states of the Union.
Yep.
And somehow that's always been don't touch the post office. But, we did it in the early 1970s. It became a government owned corporation. And the
Yep.
idea behind that was to create some efficiencies of scale that could make
Hmm.
postage more affordable, make the
Yep.
mail faster. And in some ways it worked, and in some ways it didn't. I look at the model of the USPS, and it does a lot of things really well. It is the channel that my wife and I use for our vintage clothing business to ship merchandise to paying customers all over the United States, and they do it beautifully. But then there are other things that they completely miss. The USPS could be doing so much more, especially in rural communities. They could provide banking services that they don't provide. They could be a channel for offering broadband communications in underserved communities. I mean, there are a lot of wonderful revenue generating things that this enormous governmental entity could be doing, and all the people that work for it could be doing, that they're not currently because they are still a quasi-governmental agency. So I understand the impulses of Vivek and Elon to look at something like the USPS and say, it's a hot mess and it maybe should be privatized. I'm open to that if it means that this channel that I depend on becomes more dependable, more affordable, more efficient, and perhaps can have a positive ROI as opposed to what's happening now where postage rates just keep going up and they feed the beast, and mail
Hmm.
still gets lost. And you've probably heard the term going postal. I mean, postal employees were often terribly managed and sometimes lost it.
Hmm.
But we have to be open to the ideas of people like Elon and Vivek. Elon in particular, because you know I'm old enough to remember when NASA was sending up rockets to the moon. And the only part of the technology in that enormous rocket that made it home was the service module, this little disc-shaped, you know, Hershey's Kiss-shaped thing. It was a lot of waste involved in sending people to the moon. Now that Elon has created technology where the booster rocket returns safely to Earth without being destroyed and back on the launch pad. That is brilliant.
Yep.
So I think we have to be open to how somebody like Elon could reimagine all the work that government currently does
Yep.
in a private reboot. We have to be
Yep.
open to it.
Private, 100%. I was thinking, go ahead.
However, and I spent a little time in politics, there is the Newtonian law of unintended consequences. You do something and you don't foresee the backlash from it. Okay.
Right.
I don't know if Elon fully understands that Washington, D.C. based law of physics, if you will. And I think he's
Hmm.
already getting some pushback, and I don't think he
Hmm.
understands how to
Hmm.
respond to that
Hmm.
in a useful way. Because
Yeah.
I don't think he's used to being told no.
Right.
But you
Right.
know what?
Right.
You've got 100 puffed up personalities in the United States Senate who are willing to tell him no. And even
The
for, and even 435 elected members of the House of Representatives, many of whom probably like him very much, but you know what, don't mess with me.
One of the fascinating things about running a modern tech company is that as you bring people in from other, perhaps more traditional workplaces, the onboarding time to the tools that the new tech company is using for their everyday life is actually quite significant. I didn't realize this until we started bringing in people from more workplace
Mm,
experience, that side of the world. That just the software that we're using, the way in which we interact, the speed at which we interact is really quite different, even from companies that were born 40, 50 years ago and grew up predominantly in an Microsoft 365 or Microsoft
mhm,
Office environment, dramatically different. And so Elon's been famous for saying, just look at, if you want to think about the federal government, look at the DMV and then imagine that times 100 or something like that. So what he talks about. I think it's a you use the term reboot. I think it's a fascinating opportunity to do a reboot, right? But when you do a reboot, you don't necessarily need to do a complete reformat of the entire drive, right? You reboot, you reset. Okay, let's see what now needs to be loaded up in the right order to get the right workflow. And that's, I think,
mhm.
the opportunity here is that, based on my rough calculations of $200 per square foot for federal real estate, there's about $30 billion to be saved just in cutting real estate by about 30%. And looking at some reports, um, real estate in federal workplaces is about 25% occupied at the best of times. And so I think there are other ways to make efficiencies gains over and above just saying, hey, everybody, you need to dramatically come back 5 days a week. I don't think anybody on our side of the future of work is arguing for that at all. We want outcomes. We don't want performative inputs.
Right. We want outcomes. We want positive outcomes, not, as you say, performative stuff.
Yeah.
The RTO uh, framing that Vivek and Elon have been offering, and that was in the post that you put up on LinkedIn and elsewhere, seems ripped from the headlines, if you will, for it's been used to great extent within the financial industry out of New York, where, you know, I was watching CNBC this morning. A lot of financial firms are back 5 days a week in the office. And you know what? I get that. I have a wealth advisor at a big company, and he has said to me, if you understand how I run my business, it's all human touch. People have to be in the same room to pick up on the soft language, the soft cues between various members of our team and our clients. That doesn't happen when the members of my team are distributed. So in certain cases, it makes sense to have people back in a co-location if that's how your business model works efficiently. But that's not for everybody. And I think there's been a little cynicism locally to, oh, you're borrowing what Blackstone wanted to do. I'm just arbitrarily throwing out brand
Hmm.
names, but you know what I mean. It may not work here. And so the human cost of this is that around my metropolitan area, which is vast, it's not just the called Beltway and a little bit beyond. The metropolitan area extends to exurbs that are 75 miles to the west, 50 miles to the east, down to Richmond, Virginia, which is 50, 55 miles south of Washington, D.C., and then well beyond north, beyond Baltimore. So the people to travel into D.C. have to, if they're back in the co-location, Dan, they've got to start commuting again. It's not easy for everybody. Not everybody has access to rail transit that's on time all the time. A lot of people here drive and are single drivers in their cars and they're stuck in traffic. And if they need to be in the office quickly, they have to take hot lanes, which big surprise when you get your credit card bill and that quick drive into Washington, D.C. costs you $58.25. So people who have been afforded the flexibility to work from home 3 days a week, 4 days a week, even 5 days a week have said, you know what? I'm really efficient doing my job. If my kid suddenly gets sick at daycare, I can run them over to the clinic very quickly because they're very close by. If I were at work, I'd have to drop everything and then take 3 hours to get back to my kid. And then I've lost all that time at work and everything, and my productivity would be hit.
Mm,
I am more productive. I am not a slave to a clock anymore.
hmm
If I get a brilliant idea at 3 o'clock in the morning, I wake up and I work on it and I go back to bed. So
hmm
within our federal workforce, we're really seeing some of the wonderful things that are happening around how we work. And
Yep.
so I hope that we can keep some of that
Yep.
because it's efficient. It
Yep.
makes people better engaged in the quote unquote workplace.
Yep.
And the long-term value of their hire to whoever's hiring them is better. They're
Yeah.
retained better.
Anecdotal story. Friend in Texas at the weekend. Hey, we've been forced to go back 9 to 5. What I've realized now is that I've now got a very transactional relationship with my company.
Mhm.
They had in writing that I could be hybrid remote when I joined. We had a sickly mother-in-law when I joined, so my wife decided to pause her career for a while to look after her. We moved to accommodate. I had it in writing. Now I've got to be back full time. We can't make that work. And you know what? My work is now 9 to 5. I don't give them the evenings. I don't give them the early mornings. I don't give them the weekends. I'm going to be there from 9 to 5. I'm going to put in a good shift, but yeah, I think you're right. And how do we get the blend correct of, hey, putting yourself in the right place at the right time to be there to do your best work in person and being around others, all those soft cues, soft touches you mentioned. The time to become a partner in a London law firm looks like it's grown by about 30% because of more remote structures right now. So people aren't learning as fast, being one of them. But then also the ability to be remote and get your head down and to crack on and also work around the clock. Time is really the platform for work now, not physical space, I think is what I like to say. It's the working week that is where work happens, not necessarily place. And place can just be a tool that helps you get the work done. Dan, I'm aware of taking up tons of your time. If you were Dr. Doge, you were in
Dr.
charge of
Doge.
this. Uh, what's the hybrid policy you'd put in place?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not focused. I don't hire. I never had the experience of hiring people into the federal workforce, so I'm not really sure. But I think as managers become leaders in organizations and they are better tuned into all the people in the hive that create all this great output, I hope that team leaders will be open to experimentation and ongoing experimentation. Don't stop it. Don't say, okay, we experimented. This seems good. We'll leave it this way. And maybe we'll have a rotating 3 day a week regime where some of our team members are in place certain days, that's, I don't want to see that. I want to see the spirit of ongoing experimentation because there's so much we don't know. And I mean, you mentioned the pace of AI happening so quickly. The pace of change in the workplace is equally rapid. And I'm hopeful that we will all be smart enough to say, let's keep figuring this out. Maybe where we've landed now is good, but maybe some world event's going to happen and it's going to change it again. Maybe we have another pandemic. We're certainly not going to go back to being cloistered in our homes all the time, but maybe we have learned from all our learning over the past 4 or 5 years. Maybe there are some things that we can do that we can still remain distributed, or we can still place people where they feel they will do best,
Yeah.
where they will get the most leadership guidance. I, I I have to take what's happening now as an example with the federal workplace establishment and whatever happens from it, not as a threat, but as an opportunity.
Mm,
Because we're dealing with Elon. We can't deal with it as a threat. We got to learn from him and we've got to learn
yeah.
from us, Dan.
Dan, I'll leave you this. This is from a friend from called Alex Lindsay. Too much progress people equals chaos. Too much process people equals stagnation. And that probably boils down a lot of what we're talking about here. The implied view of what each side of the fence here is seeing each other as. So, Dan, thank you so much for taking the time for joining us today. Where can people find you?
They can find the What's Your Work Fit experience, if you will, on LinkedIn. We're also on YouTube. I encourage anybody to seek me out on LinkedIn, connect up with me, have a conversation. I love meeting new people who are reimagining work and workplace, like yourself.
Awesome.